The case we present today had its beginnings in a remote region of the Appalachian Mountains in the late 19th century. Around the year 1880, a family of settlers established themselves in a valley naturally isolated by the mountain geography. This family, who would become known as the Jacksons, started as a group of just 24 people seeking religious isolation, a group that decided to sever all ties with the outside world. The patriarch, Joseph Jackson, laid down strict rules for the small community. No contact with strangers was permitted. Marriages were to occur only between the community's own members. And to leave the valley was considered an unforgivable act of betrayal. What had begun as a quest for religious purity soon transformed into an involuntary genetic experiment. Within the first 30 years, the community grew slowly. Marriages between first cousins became commonplace, and by the end of that first generation, the initial signs of genetic problems were already observable. There were children with mild malformations, learning difficulties, and a high incidence of infant mortality. By the time the second generation was born, around 1910, more serious problems were already presenting themselves. The recessive genes, now duplicated because of marriages between close relatives, began to manifest more evidently. Children were born with congenital heart problems, extra fingers, cleft palates, and mental retardation. The situation was only aggravated by the absence of adequate medical care and their absolute isolation. When the third generation arrived in the 1930s, the situation grew increasingly dramatic. By this time, practically every inhabitant of the valley shared a large portion of their genetic material. It was no longer just a matter of cousins marrying, but of people who were simultaneously cousins, uncles, and nephews in a genetic web so intricate it would be impossible to map with precision. Contributing to the feeling that this small world was all that existed was the region's harsh climate, with severe winters that isolated the community even further. Children born during this period grew up believing their physical and mental conditions were normal, since practically everyone around them presented some type of deformity or limitation. The fourth generation, born around 1950, was marked by the emergence of a peculiar syndrome that became known locally as the Jackson mark. Children were born with a bluish coloration of the skin, a rare genetic condition called methemoglobinemia caused by an enzyme deficiency. Additionally, severe facial malformations became common, featuring underdeveloped jaws, widely spaced eyes, and malformed ears. By the 1970s, the fifth generation was showing alarming signs of genetic deterioration. Fertility had drastically decreased, while infant mortality reached frightening levels of 60%. The children who did survive often could not speak or walk and presented malformations so severe that some could barely be recognized as human. It was only in 1983 that the case came to light, when a 16-year-old girl named Mary Jackson managed to escape the valley during a storm that damaged part of the property's fence. The story Mary told seemed straight out of a nightmare: generations living in total isolation, forced marriages between close relatives, and children born with increasingly severe deformities, all just a few dozen kilometers from civilization. Initially skeptical, the police organized an expedition to the valley, and what they found confirmed and even exceeded Mary's accounts. About 240 people lived in the valley, nearly all with some degree of physical deformity or cognitive limitation. Authorities discovered the community had developed its own communication system, as many members could not properly articulate words. Living conditions were primitive, without electricity or running water, and many inhabitants had never seen a car or watched television. The health authorities who examined the community members were shocked by their findings. Many presented conditions that doctors had only seen in textbooks, and some deformities were so rare they didn't even have an official nomenclature. If you want to follow more cases like this, cases that affect the entire society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. When authorities began their investigation into the Jackson case in February 1983, their first difficulty was establishing the identity of each community member. No one possessed official documents, and the naming system was as confusing as the family's genealogical tree itself. Many people shared the same name, usually honoring the community's founders, making it nearly impossible to determine who was whose child. Investigators found that the community maintained rudimentary records, mainly in an ancient Bible where births and deaths were noted. However, these records were inconsistent and often deliberately obscure, hiding the true nature of relationships. The annotations frequently omitted parents' names or used vague terms like "child of the valley" for children born from particularly close relationships. One of the first witnesses to cooperate was Martha Jackson, a woman of approximately 50 years who, despite showing evident physical signs of consanguinity, maintained sufficient cognitive capacity to communicate coherently. Martha revealed that since childhood, she had been taught the outside world was dangerous and impure, and that only within the family did the blood remain clean. Marriages were decided by the Council of Elders, Martha reported. When a girl turned 13, the elders would meet and determine which man would be her husband. Nobody questioned these decisions. Martha revealed that she was simultaneously the cousin and aunt of her husband, and that her father was also her great-uncle. The investigation faced significant resistance from the community's older members. The elders, led by 70-year-old Ezekiel Jackson, who claimed to be the guardian of family tradition, refused to cooperate and insisted the authorities had no right to interfere with their customs. "We've lived this way for generations," declared Ezekiel. "Pure blood has kept us strong against the corrupted world." This declaration stood in drastic contrast to the physical reality of the valley's inhabitants. Doctors examining the community identified a series of rare genetic conditions that had become common due to consanguinity. These included Apert syndrome, characterized by craniofacial malformations and fusion of fingers, Meckel syndrome, causing encephalocele, protrusion of the brain through the skull, and polydactyly, and various other conditions that are individually extremely rare in the general population. A particularly disturbing discovery was made when investigators found what was called the House of Special Children. It was an isolated cabin where children with the most severe deformities were kept, some chained to rudimentary beds. These children, many of whom could not feed themselves or control basic bodily functions, received minimal care and, according to reports, frequently died during the winter. The investigation also revealed the community had developed its own mythology to explain the deformities. Children born with serious problems were considered marked by God as a test of faith. In some cases, specific deformities were interpreted as signs of spiritual power, and some of the most severely affected children were treated as oracles, their inarticulate sounds interpreted as divine messages. As the investigation progressed, researchers realized they were facing an unprecedented case in modern medical literature. Never before had a community that practiced systematic consanguinity for so many consecutive generations been documented. Geneticist Dr. Robert Keller, who participated in the investigation, described the case as an involuntary genetic experiment that reveals the extreme limits of what happens when the gene pool becomes critically reduced. The investigation team faced another significant obstacle: the absence of an adequate legal framework to deal with the situation. Technically, consanguineous marriages were illegal in the state, but as none were officially registered, it was difficult to determine which laws had been violated. Additionally, many originally responsible for implementing this practice had already died. A turning point occurred when researchers found evidence that the community had not been completely isolated the entire time. Recovered documents indicated that men from the community occasionally made incursions to nearby towns for essential supplies. More disturbing still, there were indications that occasionally women from outside were brought to the valley, usually against their will, in an attempt to renew the blood. Sarah Williams, a 62-year-old woman from a nearby town, recognized specific facial characteristics in photographs shown by investigators. She revealed that her younger sister had disappeared in 1952 at age 17 and was never seen again. "We always believed she had run away to the big city," said Sarah. "We never imagined she could be so close, living a nightmare." The investigation also faced profound ethical dilemmas. How to proceed with community members who had been both victims and perpetrators of the system? How to reintegrate into society people never exposed to the modern world, many with significant cognitive limitations? And, perhaps most importantly, how to deal with recently born children, many of whom needed urgent medical interventions? As these complex questions were debated, investigators continued to unravel the history of the Jackson community. Each discovery seemed more disturbing than the last, revealing layers of isolation, abuse, and genetic deterioration that extended for more than a century. In August 1983, 6 months after the investigation began, researchers made a discovery that fundamentally changed their understanding of the case. During an excavation near the community cemetery, the remains of more than 300 children were found, many with extreme bone deformities. Subsequent analyses revealed these graves dated from different periods over the last 100 years, indicating the infant mortality rate was even higher than initially suspected. Forensic examinations of the remains revealed consistent patterns of malformations that worsened with passing generations. The oldest graves contained skeletons with relatively mild anomalies, extra fingers or partial bone fusions. The more recent graves presented extreme deformities, drastically malformed skulls, absence of limbs, and cases of conjoined twins who had not survived birth. Dr. Elizabeth Norcross, a geneticist specializing in rare hereditary diseases, was called to analyze the genetic data. Using advanced techniques for the time, she managed to partially reconstruct the Jackson family tree. "What we discovered is unprecedented in medical literature," she declared. "The coefficient of consanguinity in the most recent generation surpasses anything ever documented in human populations. In some cases, we're talking about individuals who share more than 70% of their genetic material, something theoretically impossible in a viable population." Dr. Norcross identified more than 40 rare genetic conditions within the community, many of which normally occur in less than 1 in 100,000 people. Most alarming, however, was the discovery that some observed conditions were completely new to medical science, combinations of genetic anomalies never before documented, resulting from the unique interaction of multiple recessive mutations that would rarely manifest together in a population with normal genetic diversity. In September 1983, the investigation took another surprising turn when 19-year-old Jacob Jackson, one of the youngest members, began cooperating extensively. Jacob, who had relatively mild facial deformities and preserved cognitive capacity, revealed he had suspected for years that something was wrong. "When I was a child, I found a basic biology book among the supplies brought from town," he recounted. "That's when I realized that what they told us about being special and chosen wasn't true. We were sick, and our leaders knew it." Jacob revealed the existence of hidden documents kept by the elders, which included newspaper clippings and even scientific articles about genetics and heredity. "They knew what they were causing," he stated. In private meetings, the elders discussed which marriages would produce fewer monsters, as they called them. It wasn't ignorance. It was deliberate control. This revelation transformed the investigation, introducing criminal aspects. If Jacob's claims were true, the leaders had deliberately perpetuated practices they knew to be harmful, effectively condemning generations to suffering. The investigation received another boost when scientists analyzed DNA samples from the community's founder, Joseph Jackson. The results were surprising. Joseph already carried genes for several rare recessive conditions, including the methemoglobinia that caused the bluish skin. This finding suggested the decision to establish an isolated community may have been motivated partly by a desire to hide a pre-existing genetic condition. In October 1983, authorities made another disturbing discovery in a sealed basement, diaries kept by generations of Jackson women, reporting in agonizing detail the births, deformities, and premature deaths. These diaries, written in a mixture of archaic English and a community-developed dialect, revealed that not everyone had passively accepted the system. There were reports of escape attempts, women trying to avoid pregnancies, and even merciful infanticides. One diary from 1937 contained a particularly moving passage: "Today I gave birth to what should be my son, but God in his infinite cruelty transformed him into something I cannot recognize as human. The elder says it is a test of our faith. But what kind of God tests his children this way? I begin to suspect it is not God who tests us, but the men who speak in his name." As these documents were translated, a more complex image emerged. It was not a group uniformly committed to fanatical beliefs, but a hierarchical social structure where a male elite maintained absolute control using a mixture of religious indoctrination and physical isolation. Leave in the comments, never give up on truth if you believe that all missing persons deserve to be found, all victims deserve justice, and all closed communities need to be investigated. In November 1983, after 9 months of intense investigation, authorities decided to definitively intervene. The operation, involving medical teams, social workers, psychologists, and police, was carefully planned to minimize trauma for a population with no significant contact with the outside world. The 237 surviving community members were evacuated and temporarily housed in adapted facilities at a state hospital. There, each individual underwent complete medical evaluations, which confirmed the devastating extent of the damage. The results were alarming. 98% of members presented some genetic condition associated with consanguinity. Among children under 10, the figure was 100%, with many needing immediate medical intervention. Dr. James Harlow, coordinator of the medical team, declared, "In my 35 years of medical practice, I have never seen so many rare conditions concentrated in a single group. We are essentially witnessing the final result of a genetic experiment that no ethics committee would ever allow." Authorities faced unprecedented legal and ethical questions. With no official records, the legal status of each member had to be established from scratch. The question of criminal responsibility was also complex. Investigators identified 12 elders who appeared to have knowledge of the risks yet still imposed them. However, many of these men also presented cognitive limitations from previous generations of consanguinity. How to evaluate the culpability of individuals who were themselves products and victims of the system? After extensive deliberations, authorities opted to focus on rescue and rehabilitation rather than punishment. Ezekiel Jackson and 2 other elders with full cognitive capacity were charged with various crimes, including child abuse and criminal negligence. The others were considered unable to respond criminally due to their limitations. In January 1984, the difficult process of integration began. For adults, especially the older ones, the transition was extremely traumatic. Many never adapted and spent their lives in specialized institutions. For children, the prognosis was more promising. Those with preserved cognitive capacities demonstrated surprising resilience. Mary Jackson, whose escape had initiated the investigation, became an inspiring example. After intensive medical treatments and therapy, she completed high school and eventually became an advocate for the rights of people with genetic disabilities. The most severely affected children were welcomed into specialized institutions, where medical care, while unable to reverse deformities, significantly improved their quality of life. In 1985, the Jackson Foundation was established to coordinate ongoing care and support research on the rare genetic conditions observed. Genetic material from the family became a valuable resource for researchers worldwide, helping to identify specific genes and contributing to the development of predictive genetic tests. The valley was transformed into a natural reserve with a small memorial honoring the hundreds of victims of an involuntary human experiment. The plaque contains a simple message in memory of those who lived and died in isolation, and as a reminder of our collective responsibility to protect the most vulnerable. The Jackson case generated significant changes in public policies related to isolated communities. Several states implemented monitoring programs to identify potentially at-risk groups, facing the delicate balance between respecting religious freedom and protecting vulnerable individuals, especially children. In genetics, the case led to renewed academic interest in the effects of consanguinity. Comparative studies with other historically isolated populations helped establish clearer parameters about the risks associated with different degrees of kinship. In 2003, 20 years after the discovery, a team of documentarians located and interviewed 45 survivors. Their testimonies revealed diverse trajectories. Some had fully integrated into mainstream society, forming families and building careers. Others lived in assisted communities, and some remained institutionalized, their bodies and minds permanently marked. Jacob Jackson, who had been fundamental in exposing the suppressed knowledge, became a geneticist dedicated to studying rare diseases. "What happened to my family cannot be undone," he declared at a medical conference in 2010. "But we can ensure these lives were not lost in vain. Each gene identified, each child saved from a condition we can now prevent, is a victory over the obscurantism that kept my family in captivity for generations." Perhaps the most enduring legacy is the awareness about the risks of consanguinity and the importance of genetic diversity. In countries where marriages between cousins are culturally accepted, educational programs now include information about genetic risks and offer premarital counseling and testing. The preserved genetic samples from the Jackson community continue to be a valuable resource. In 2015, using new genetic sequencing technologies, scientists identified specific patterns of genetic deterioration over the 7 generations, providing unprecedented insights into how the human gene pool responds to extreme isolation. The case of the 7 generations of the Jackson family remains one of the most extreme and well-documented examples of the effects of prolonged consanguinity in humans. It is a story of isolation, control, and suffering, but also of resilience, scientific discovery, and finally, redemption through knowledge. If you watched until here, it's because you care about these cases that mark families forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here, so I can get to know you and know who really cares about the search for truth." Don't forget to like this video so it reaches more people, and share it with friends interested in real cases. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, this is the ideal moment to become part of our community that isn't afraid to face humanity's most difficult truths. Next week, we'll bring another equally impactful case that will reveal how seemingly normal communities can hide disturbing secrets for decades. Until then, remember, truth, however painful it may be, is always the first step toward healing. Experiences throughout its complexity.